Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to panel number 2, Advocacy in the Family. We are so delighted that you could join us today. My name is Kathy Dishner, and I will be moderating the panel as a volunteer with Emotions Matter, where I also serve on the executive board. While I'm doing the introductions, we invite you to write in our chat where you're joining us from today. And also, there'll be an opportunity for you to add questions that we will try to get to at the end of the broadcast. So the first thing I'd like to do is kind of go through a little bit of housekeeping, introduce you to Emotions Matter, and set the guidelines for this space. So hold on one moment while I share a screen with you. Welcome to our BPDFest. I want to share Emotions Matter's mission. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2015 to support, educate, and advocate for those impacted with borderline personality disorder. Our vision is to create a world in which every person with BPD has access to treatment and resources for a meaningful recovery. Emotions Matter strives to create a safe and judgment-free space for people with borderline personality disorder. We accept that there is a spectrum of experiences within our BPD community. We honor where people are on the journey without judgment or assumptions. We encourage people to define their own path toward recovery. And we speak as experts of our own lived experience, not as medical experts. So just a bit of guidelines for our engagement today. Questions during our session should be asked using our Q&A box, not the chat. Comments can be made in the chat box as we go along. Please use respectful language in the session chat. Any inappropriate messaging, including harassment, bullying, or monopolizing the chat, will be deleted. We accept difference and we promote acceptance, especially with regard to gender, sexual orientation, identity, race, ethnicity, age, religion, disability, or politics. Please avoid explicit expressions of self-harm or trauma, which might be upsetting to others. Panels and plenary sessions will be recorded and available after the conference, so no screenshots or recording on personal devices, please. And just as a guideline disclaimer, if at any time during this you find yourself overwhelmed or struggling for any reason in need of support, we encourage you to reach out to your support system. Audience members might experience intense and painful emotions, feelings, memories, thoughts, or reactions to content shared. So please participate at your own risk. And you're always welcome to take a break from our BPD Fest at any time or withdraw from it entirely if necessary. In the event of any sort of a medical emergency, please seek care through a doctor, hospital, or emergency call numbers such as 911 in the U.S. immediately. And last, if you're in the New York area, we'll be doing a walk on June 5th. We welcome everyone to this event. And if you're interested in making a gift, please know that it makes a huge difference and enables us to continue to do our work for all those in our BPD community. So I'm going to stop sharing and bring us back to our panel. Welcome back, everybody. So having gone through all of that, I'd like an opportunity to introduce the speakers that are in our panel today. So in this session, our speakers are going to speak from their lived experience with BPD and about how they learn to advocate for themselves in their family relationships and in their relationships with loved ones. Mental health professionals will discuss family advocacy, related skills, and the importance of advocating for oneself in the family support system and beyond. So if you'll give me a moment, I'd like to introduce briefly two of the people that are with us right now. First, I'll start with Oliver McDonald. He's from Ontario, Canada, and has lived experience with BPD, PTSD, and addictions. He is currently in recovery. He has a 5-year-old son, a lovely wife and family, and he works full-time for the Ontario government. He also is a dedicated board member for Emotions Matter, as well as other local nonprofit associations that focus on mental health advocacy and youth recreation. Welcome, Oliver. I'd also like to welcome Brittany. Brittany Frank is a PhD candidate in medical anthropology and currently working on her dissertation research with adults who, like her, live with BPD. She is committed to advocating for the value of peer-led research while also serving as an active support in the BPD community, including as a peer facilitator for Emotions Matter. She's also a poet, painter, and classical pianist who uses creative expression to educate others about the experience of struggling and living with BPD. And last, I'd like to introduce Paula Zaremba. She is a family member of someone with lived experience of BPD and a public health professional focused on mental health with a strong interest in learning more about emotional dysregulation and BPD. She's an adopted Latina who identifies strongly with mental health challenges herself and has a passion for growing awareness of BPD, story sharing, and access to equitable mental health treatment, particularly among communities of color and transracially adopted individuals. So I welcome all three of you and thank you so much for being here today. I'm looking forward to having a discussion. And first off, I think it's nice, I've given a very brief intro of each of you, but I'd like to give you each a moment in your own words to introduce yourself more fully and describe what challenges you faced in your family dynamic. And I will start with Brittany.
Thank you. Well, when I think back on my BPD journey, it's hard to separate out exactly where it started. It feels like it's always been there in some way for me. I grew up in a home filled with violently intense emotions, volatility, and fear. As a child, distress and confusion inward, learning early on to withdraw into my schoolwork, which at least elicited approval when I excelled. I was often the sick one in the family, and most chastised for being the one who could never smile, for being moody or judgmental and dramatic. Instead of being a kid, I took on the worrier role with my mother, constantly worried about how much she had to work to support all of us kids, how exhausted she always seemed, and how she was treated by her spouse. I was bullied in school, so my sister, who was 18 months older than me, was tasked early on with being my protector, sitting in the library with me at lunchtime, and later, when she moved to college, trying to watch out for me from afar. I did my best to follow all the rules, be obedient daughter and a perfect student. I was the youngest in my family, so I bore the brunt of the treatment at home and didn't escape until I was in my late 20s. By the time I moved to Arizona in 2015 to start my PhD, I had learned to mask very well so I could function academically. But inside, I was utterly lost and panicked, not understanding why I felt so intensely isolated from the world, why I would try to get to know people only to have them tell me I was too much or too intense, and why my emotions would go from 0 to 100 without warning, especially anger and especially at those that I love the most, especially my mother. Up to that point, my family had increasingly felt like they had to tiptoe around me, not sure what would set me off or why my thinking was so rigid, why something was okay for them to say one day and then the next day it wasn't okay, and why I seemed to push people away who were trying to love me. They became worried about ever sharing good news for fear I would sink into an ever darker and longer episodes of depression. And I could really tell my mother felt hopeless and guilty. When she tried to help, it had the opposite effect, and then she would feel worse, and then I would feel worse for making her sad. I tried to find help at our university health center. I even checked into an inpatient hospital for many months. I borrowed thousands of dollars for outpatient programs, but no one seemed to know what to do with me. My sister was having to go through the excruciating decision of trying to help me find a hospital to check into again. Thankfully, at this point, I found my current psychiatrist, and I got my BPD diagnosis in 2018 in my early 30s, along with the first of many book recommendations for my mother. As those of you with BPD might have experienced, that's just the start of another leg of the journey of hard inner work, hard work learning to relate to each other, to others differently, including my family, figuring out what my own needs were and how to advocate for them while being in a relationship with others and the ways that my needs impacted them. At the beginning, I had a hard time getting out of all or nothing as I swung between triaging my own life and repairing relationships. Sometimes I'd disappear completely from contact so I could put every ounce of my energy and focus into getting the basics of my life back on track: therapy homework, finding a place to live, and eventually working my way back into my PhD program, starting with community college again, where I'm now working on my dissertation research in my PhD program on BPD. Then at other times, when I reach stretches of stability, I would surface again, diving instead of putting in my toes into the messiness of trying to reconnect with the world, including the few family members who are still there waiting for me. Now I'm trying to work on a balance, trying to learn to connect with them without it having to be either super intense or nothing at all, exploring if there might be something in the middle. I know I left emotional bruises on some of my family members with my words, even when I didn't know why I was like that. But I'm blessed that some of them have continued loving me anyway. Other family members have been unwilling or unable to welcome me, including my BPD struggle, into their lives, and I do have to grieve that. To some of them, I seemed too unreliable. I missed important events over the years as I moved from crisis to crisis. Or it was hard for them to understand why medications couldn't fix my problems. My symptoms were also a reminder of what happened in our family, and some people didn't want to face that. But there is a card I have on my refrigerator that my older sister wrote me when I was at one of my lowest and scariest points. I had written to her about how I wasn't sure that I could go on. And she wrote to me to tell me how grateful she was I was willing to tell her that, and that she wanted to be honest back and tell me she was terrified about the thought of losing her sister. I realized that this wasn't just scary for me, that this was scary for them too. And being able to share that gave us a common place from which to build forward. Yes, construction takes longer than planned, as I'm learning from my brother in law from construction at his house right now. Doesn't it always? But it's really worth the work. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you, Brittany. That was a beautiful share, and I want to make sure we pick up on some things that you mentioned as we go forward. And we'll allow some others to introduce themselves too at this time. Oliver, would you like to join us?
Thanks, Kathy. It's a pleasure to join today's discussion and introduce myself to the group a little further. Uh, Looking back on my life has never been an easy task for me. My journey with emotional dysregulation and misunderstanding likely began at birth. I was known as the baby that was hard to settle or that nobody wanted to babysit, unfortunately. I struggled with extreme anger and isolation, abuse, neglect, poor health, and no real understanding of self, and unfortunately growing up in a low-income home, despite my mom's best efforts. We moved multiple times to multiple cities and through multiple provinces while my parents struggled to maintain work and balance their relationship. And this made it extremely difficult for me as I grew up to try and learn how to develop relationships and make those work properly. As I grew into my teens, I struggled to find an identity that was acceptable to myself and my new potential friends. We moved from a larger city center to a small country farm where I found myself constantly being badly beaten up and bullied in school, in trouble with the law, and I started to find alcohol and drugs as a way to balance out my anger and sadness to cope with life. This is where I developed what I refer to as my two identities that help shape me to today, sort of like spirit creatures. A cockroach and a chameleon are the two that I found that best described me, as strange as that is. I could run and hide. I was impossible to kill. I served a great purpose in life, yet I was fully misunderstood. I could be extremely capable of blending into my current environment to avoid being seen and ultimately accepted in some way. This is also where I developed my love to help others and give back. My parents were at the end of a horrible marriage broken by alcohol and violence, and I had to defend my mother while at the same time trying to ensure my father survived. My relationship with him was everything to me, and it was a dichotomy between terrible abuse and my deepest desires to kind of have his attention. It was really all I really wanted. Unfortunately, I didn't get that chance, and I lost him to a death by suicide about 7 years ago on Christmas Day. As the oldest son and executor of his affairs, I had to tackle that horrible task of closing out his life, and that has, and I think forever will, have ruined and shaped me in a different way. It took about 7 years to fully crash, and last February I was forced off work due to the disabilities and diagnosed with severe mental illnesses and some physical health issues like cancer and COPD. During my early adulthood, I used my resilience to move forward. I moved away, met my beautiful wife, and started my career in nursing, and moved on to a new job about every 5 years, as it seemed, as I kind of figured out where I was and learned the skills and found that I wanted something new. I discovered and started to more fully understand that I had a terrible fear of abandonment, and I would do absolutely anything to keep those relationships intact. Now, I'm lucky to have a marriage that I work hard every day to maintain. I've got a beautiful 5-year-old son. He's happy, healthy, polite, loves to smile, play some baseball. I'm working hard on my recovery as best as I know how, and I'm struggling to find a balance between my own family, being my mom and my sister, and my wife's family and my current family, my wife and my son, as I recover and try to figure out how we all live together. I found my path to hope through Emotions Matter last year, and right now, all I can say is I'm a work in progress. So thank you, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That was wonderful to hear from you. A very brave story, and it's so wonderful to see you in recovery. And it's wonderful to share Emotions Matter and be on the board with you. Now, I'd like to let our not least but last presenter, Paula, come and talk to us a little bit about her story, and then we'll open it up to discussion among all of us. Paula.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you everyone for having me here. I'm so glad I made it in. Had some technical issues right at the last second, so I'm so glad to be here and to have this space. And Brittany and Oliver, what you shared resonates so much for me as a sibling of someone with lived experience of BPD. So similar, very similar circumstances and situations and feelings. And I just thank you so much for sharing your stories. I would like to share, as the sibling of a loved one with BPD, a little bit about the challenges that come to mind in our relationship and family dynamic. And I'd also really like to take some time to share some of the strengths and things I've especially appreciated about this journey. So growing up as siblings, I was aware that my loved one had very intense emotional reactions and outbursts that were different, very passionate, very intense. I didn't know there was language for this. In general, myself and my family members were pretty emotional people. We're pretty passionate. So I knew that my sibling had more intensity, but I didn't really know much beyond that. My sibling wasn't diagnosed until a few years ago, so growing up, I didn't truly understand. I kind of just thought, well, that's my sibling. That's how they react. I think moments of anger were some of the hardest moments for us. Anger tends to be a very hard emotion for me to understand and deal with, and in moments of escalation and not having my own emotional understandings of myself really, and knowing that all people can get emotionally dysregulated, at times fights with my siblings would be extremely heightened and sometimes even scary. And I think about how sadness was very painful for myself and for my family. I wasn't always sure how to best support depressive episodes of my loved one, nor was I aware myself when I was likely going through some depressed feelings myself, as I'm also someone who struggles and lives with mental health challenges. So looking back at my childhood and adolescence, I wish I had understood. I would have had more patience, more kindness, more empathy for what my sibling was going through. And I really feel I'm playing catch up in a lot of ways now. So I also think about the challenge of just not having much family representation. Not a ton of family and sibling stories are out there, and it's a unique sibling experience. Also, there isn't much in the way of adopted family representation. So there's not much in the way of resources for us. And myself and siblings were adopted. We are biological. Um, and in general, there aren't many resources for families of color and for people of color in our BPD community. I think also about the challenge of practicing acceptance skills, really accepting where my family is at, where my loved one is at in their journey, and working on letting go of controlling our healing journeys. I'm working on following my siblings' lead in the care and treatment that they want and honoring and respecting this. So I also think about how intense emotional dysregulation can be painful. It can be a challenge for all of us, but it's also because of how our systems of care, how they're set up, and how much they are or aren't equipped to support us and our BPD community. Some of the things I've been especially appreciative about in this journey has just been the understanding and learning about the intuition of my sibling, and just when they access and when we talk about wise mind and this balance of emotional and rational mind, discussed in dialectical behavior therapy or DBT. I just am in awe of my siblings' ability to teach me and for us to practice what that means. I also appreciate the chance to talk about things now, to learn a new language together related to emotional regulation and validation, and trying to practice this. My parents and I have tried to learn a lot through reading books, learning about DBT, practicing skills. I also appreciate the chance to learn about the neurobiology of BPD and how a very active fight or flight stress response, it just makes so much sense to me why and how emotions can be so intense for those with BPD and for myself, since we all can get dysregulated, we all have fight or flight stress response systems. I appreciate that relationships can be very healing. We have a chance to connect and contribute to each other's journeys. And my sibling and I really bond and have deep empathy and emotional connection. And I love and appreciate our friendship. I also appreciate the resources that are out there for family members and siblings, like family connections classes through NEA BPD, an online DBT skills course my family and I have explored, and really the chance to practice validation and acceptance skills across my relationships, especially my closest relationships. Emotional regulation and dysregulation language has really changed my life over the past several years. So I really, in closing, I just wanted to share that I'm learning. I'm learning from my sibling. I'm learning through this experience. Our dynamic is shifting, and throughout this journey, I've been able to see the gray area in our family experience. I'm able to see the challenges and strengths, and I'm really grateful. And I'm grateful this experience is ours, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Paula, thank you so much. So much of what you just said resonates with me as the mother of an adult daughter with BPD, who found things like family connections and dialectical behavioral training and doing the research and the education to become better connected. It's such an important thing, I think, when family members can do that and be with their loved one in a real way. It's very impactful. And as you said, finding that balance in the wise mind of acceptance is a very difficult thing sometimes to do, but exceptionally rewarding when you're able to, because it reduces suffering for everyone, yourself and the person in your life that you love. So I'm going to ask Brittany and Oliver to join us again um, visually so I can see you. I think that where Paula has just left off is a really nice place for us to pick up. Having spoken from the perspective of someone who, has done a lot of work on her own to understand this condition and help someone in a family situation. Brittany and Oliver, could you speak maybe to that a little bit? Did you find that some of the people in your family and your network also did this kind of work? Was it helpful? Was that your experience? I'd love to hear from each of you.
Go ahead, Brittany.
Yeah, so in my experience, it was definitely mixed. I think, as I suggested earlier, for me, some people in my family definitely, for whatever reason, they didn't really pick up on the resources that I sent, or it was, challenging for them to try to understand this as an illness, and that it is kind of a longer term work, and that it's something that doesn't just kind of come and go, even if I've been in a treatment facility, etc. But I will say, for those that I do have a relationship with, they've definitely put in the work. Like, I can say for my mother, she started going to her own therapy. She came to a therapy session that I had with my psychiatrist, and she still remembers when she walked in and met this person who could understand her daughter. And when she sat down to talk and just started talking, she remembered him saying, like, no, you need to listen. And we talked about validation and how to do that. And for her, it was like the first time someone was giving her tools to be able, for us even to be able to communicate, so then I could teach her and she could teach me. And so she reads a lot of books, and likes to watch videos from mental health professionals about borderline. And then the rest of it was really one-on-one communication between my siblings, educating themselves by asking me questions. And so I found their willingness to work with me on it was very helpful.
Yeah. Oliver, what about you?
Um, I share very similar elements to what Brittany described. I mean, for me, I am married, so I have I sort of two spheres that I look at this in. One being my relationship with my family, my primary family being my mom and my sister, um, and two being my relationship with my wife's family, and not excluding my wife and my son, but just sort of looking at those two groups a little differently. Um, my initially, I didn't really want anything to do with my mom because I was blaming, ashamed. My growing up wasn't the best. And as I started to describe that, it was very hurtful for her and pushed her away. And I realized that she played a role in that, and she started to realize that. So it was difficult. Um, the other side was my wife's family, where she's a mental health professional. Wife's mom is a nurse, medical nurse, very educated side of that. And picking up the resources, my mom took it on immediately, read the books, did whatever she could, started to use the skills. My wife's side, not so much. And it wasn't intentional, or at least from what I think it is, it's more a really hard path to figure out what's going on and accept now the answers to all the questions they might have had about the behaviors and struggles for the last 20 years that they've seen with their daughter, who is their primary person to support. So that's been very difficult for me to try and have such success on one side, as I describe success being somebody using the skills and taking them up, and me feeling that, because seeing the change that my mom did and my sister did, I've noticed that those skills really help. I mean, we can connect, we can communicate where I feel like I'm understood, and then it also showed me that there's a huge gap in what I'm not feeling from the other side.
Mm.
And now I'm finally at a point where I can separate myself and try to see it from their perspective. And that's been a pivotal moment, I think, in recovery, because I'm not saying it's going well, but at least it's at a moment now where there's more clarity. So, I think using the whatever skills you can have, and DBT was great. So I hope
Yeah.
that helps.
Yeah. And I mean, just speaking as a mother, and Paula, you're a sister. I mean, I felt that DBT provided a new language and a new way of approaching everything. And there was so much recognition once I learned those skills in what had been poor communication, really, and invalidating behavior that I wasn't even aware of. And I think what a lot of people can relate to is that it comes from always a place of love, often. You know, you're
Totally.
loving the person in your life, and yet there's a breakdown and you're not communicating or you're not validating. You can love and not validate at the same time, which was a very big thing for me to learn. And I ask you guys now, and I open this up to all of you, um, for individuals with BPD, articulating needs with family members, especially emotional needs, can be challenging, you know, for all these reasons that you guys have brought up. And so, what do you think has been most helpful to improve communication and trust in your relationships?
Um, for me, really, it's been first learning how to communicate in an effective way so that I can help teach and support and understand somebody's journey through that, because you don't start educated, right? So you can't ask somebody to be a great communicator or expect them to be if you had to learn to be one yourself. So, the difficulty is the immediacy of the need. You're vulnerable, you're recently diagnosed, undiagnosed, struggling. You need somebody immediately to communicate with you, but they don't know how and you don't know how. So that was must have been difficult for everyone. And really for me, it was building some structure, trying to create a very specific set of questions. When this happens, I'm triggered and feel this way. I need this from you. you know um eh, Trying to give them the opportunity to say the same things, right? I found that very beneficial and allowed us to work through the moments that we were never able to work through before. So, because that was really a tough one, because articulating what you need, at least for me, has been impossible as I've described it. Now I see it as potentially capable.
Mm. Brittany and Paulo.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
For me, the first step I had to do was really to be able to say how unfair it felt to me, to be honest. I think at the beginning it was like, well, I have to do all of my inner work and I have to do all this work to try to get myself back on track. And now I have to also, I felt like now I have to also teach my family members how to be with me. And I think I had to be able to say out loud and acknowledge that that felt unfair to me. And that, yes, I could acknowledge life isn't fair, but that, it did feel like a big task. And I have to still say that sometimes when I'm like exhausted by the end of the day. So I think for me, one thing has been honoring how exhausting it feels for me sometimes, and that I can still do it as I feel exhausted. And that without having connection, I don't get to move into what I feel like living is. And so it's worth it. The other thing I'd say is boundaries. Like with my siblings, especially, establishing boundaries and clear expectations was really important. So, like, I had to learn to have both, like, my need for structure and stability, and then learn to be flexible. So, if I establish a boundary with my sister that when I feel this, I'm going to say these words to her, and then she knows to give me those 15 minutes alone, then we have those expectations. Now, if something happens and that isn't possible, and she tries to communicate that to me, then I need to try to use my self-soothing to be able to work through it. So if we have clear boundaries, and it's even better if it's written down, because then if one of us crosses it, then it's like, hey, let's revisit this. We have the language for doing that. And that takes a big leap of faith, I think. So, my mother and I had to agree, especially as we worked on our codependent relationship, that if one of us says, I'm fine, this isn't disguising things to sort of be like, oh, I'm fine, and now you have to guess. Now we have to take a leap of faith that when the other person says, I'm fine, they mean it until proven otherwise. And we just have to keep doing that over and over until we build the trust that really is it. And so those are a few things that have worked for me.
Paula, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I hear you so much, Brittany, on like the feelings of unfairness. I think about that often, and think there's such a balance among family members and siblings, because I agree. I don't think it would be totally fair to expect my loved one to teach me. And yet I want to remain open to being taught, it's like, it's finding that balance. It's not black and white. And I just also am so committed to doing my own work and forgiving myself when I didn't know better in the past. So yeah, I feel you on that. And I also think about it with any other ism, just this process of learning and unlearning and doing our own internal and emotional work. Like it's not necessarily fair to ask others with whatever identity it is, to teach the rest of us. There are resources out there, although there could be more. So that's just one thought I had in reaction to what you shared, Brittany. And I think as far as communicating needs, some things that have helped, definitely agree with the piece on boundaries. I think, I think that goes both ways. I think, just for me as someone who in the past and currently sometimes also still struggles with feeling assertive enough, or that I have a right to like self-validate for my own emotions, and knowing that in any relationship, it's a process together to find out the ways that work best for both of us to communicate. So I think just for me, keeping that openness to discussing what works well and practicing boundaries and respecting my loved ones' boundaries too. And that's new. That's only in the last 5-6 years that I've even had language for that, and it takes time.
It does take time, Paula. I agree so much with what all of you shared. And to find the space needed sometimes within relationships is hard. It requires everybody sometimes to allow more room than maybe you want to at that moment, when you do have a tendency sometimes, like Paula, you said, to want to control something and to let that go. And also, obviously, the shame and blame game, which doesn't help anyone. And it's so easy to look back on your own behavior, on your behavior of loved ones, the shoulda, coulda, would-haves, and recognize there's no value in holding on to those. And finding the ability to really let them go, I think, can be very challenging but very liberating. And a lot of you spoke to that. We have just a few more minutes, and I'd like an opportunity to ask you, because you all are such inspirational stories of recovery, of hope, of strength. What strategies would you offer others on their road to recovery?
Something that came to mind as Oliver was talking was the idea of like, how to even know what emotional needs are, like what my own emotional needs are in itself was so hard. Like, it'd be great if I came with an instruction manual that was like, here's what you need. So I kind of like created one for myself.
So true.
Yeah, it probably helps that I have to do this with ethnography anyway, but I keep a mini notebook with me. And when I'm interacting with, especially at the beginning, when I'm interacting with anybody and something either triggers me or it feels good or whatever reaction I have, I write it down. And that way it's like, oh, someone just said everyone experiences that. Well, I'm going to write down that that's probably not a helpful thing to say because I had a very strong reaction. But if someone says, I hear you, then I notice action. So I started keeping a log of like all of the phrases that people use that are either really helpful or not. And I share those with family members. So they kind of have a script to start with. And then, eventually we can start improvising after we have like a base script. And so the other thing was for me getting creative. So some family members, I would just send them like my raw poetry so they could hear read what was going on inside of me. Other family members, like make a collage, make a comic strip, write a joke, like whatever creative outlet you might have. It's a way of at least giving somebody a glimpse of like the struggle that's happening inside, which I feel like for, my sisters, especially for them, it was the first time to ever know like, whoa, like that's what you experience inside, reading memoirs. So those were two things that really helped for me.
Yeah.
That's so great, Brittany. And I appreciate, it's funny as we talk, you you realize what you've been doing without really realizing it.
Mm.
And I know it sounds technical, even it does as I listen to it, and I imagine it's the same for the audience, that to get scripted and write things down and try to be that, I don't know if bureaucratic's a good word for it, but very organized and on paper gives you a place to refine, or course correct, right? Like if you're off 1 degree at the beginning of a sailing journey, you're off 30 miles at the end, right? So why not change the degree at the beginning? And journaling the phrases and the emotions and what works and doesn't is very beneficial. But having something that you can share that isn't like taking it and putting it onto a piece of paper that's clean and not your mind on paper as you've written it also helps, because you don't want people to necessarily see your journal. It's a safe place for you, so know that you can take it out and put it somewhere else. But I think, to me, as I think about strategies, the core of all of that is really the underpinning of, like, belief in yourself. What I've learned in the beginning is I had no hope. There was just no tomorrow. Everything to me, even still today, it gets like that. And I have to remember, in the worst emotional storm I experience, that I do and can weather that storm, as bad as it gets, right? So just to have that belief has made everything else more manageable and doable. And when I forget that, everything else falls apart. So I think that's the core thing that I would emphasize to everybody is find something that works after you really do believe in yourself. Um, and then try to give others an opportunity to say what works for them and read their script and then blend the two together.
Thank you, Oliver. Paula, would you like to add?
Sure. And Oliver, I love what you said. So well said. I think I would add to family members two books that have really, really helped me in my understanding. One is Valerie Poor's book called Overcoming Borderline Personality Disorder, A Family Guide to Healing and Change. And the other book is Borderline Personality Disorder Demystified by Dr. Robert Friedel. So I definitely recommend those. And then I would just say, honoring and understanding the family perspective, the caregiver and the sibling relationship can be very similar but very different as well. So just recognizing that there are differences. And then I would say for my siblings out there, my like other siblings, I would say encourage you to find what helps you empathize with your sibling and see their side, understand what they're going through. Also, I would say seek support for yourself. I'm in therapy regularly. I struggle with my mental health too, so I get support for myself. And then the last thing I would share is for our family members is to try to keep an eye out for any biases that we hold towards people with serious mental health challenges. Um, and then also one other thing is practicing acceptance skills and validation skills. I found that to be very helpful across many relationships. So,
Brittany, did you want to add something too before we wrap up?
Yeah, when I was thinking about what was challenging, what my family members told me was most challenging for them as I started like growing in my journey and learning a little bit more, was my fear of them ever telling me I was doing something well. So if they noticed that, for example, I didn't react as strongly to things that they learned to say, I know you are still struggling, and I see that you didn't react in this X way. And that way I didn't have such a fear of like, there can be a fear of getting better sometimes, because then I'm afraid I'm going to be abandoned by like all of the help, all of the people in my family helping me. So learning to adjust the language.
Brittany, thank you. And I'm sorry to cut you a little short. I feel like one of the language things I learned as a phrase that always works with my daughter is tell me more. And I wish I could say that to all of you and continue to stay here all afternoon. You are fantastic. I want to thank all of you for being so candid, for sharing your stories, and for being such a phenomenal inspiration. Thank you all very, very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.